Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Squawk Talk on Socialist Telly. And tonight we will be looking at the issue of NHS pay, which is reaching a certain boiling point in the country at the moment, in England at least, and is being failed on most sides by politicians, with a few honourable exceptions. Again, in England, the NHS is a devolved issue for other nations. And I'm delighted to be joined tonight by Bonnie from the Socialist Telly crew. And then we have two Hollies, Holly Johnston, who's coming to us from Sheffield, I believe, who is a nurse, just finished a shift in an oncology ward at her hospital. We have Holly Turner, and we have Ruby, whose surname I don't have on the screen at the minute. But again, three nurses, and all here to talk about the issue of NHS pay and the paltry offer that's been made by the government, but also the paltry lack of demand for anything better that's being put forward by the Labour Party as well. We seem to have Holly there twice, but she looks as though she's live and active with us now. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming up to the show. I will just remind people this is available on Twitter, on Facebook, and on YouTube, Socialist Telly, except for Facebook, where it's Squawk Box. And you will be able to participate in the programme through the comments and put your questions as well that will field to the panel as and when the conversation allows. So who'd like to kick us off? Holly T, do you want to give us a quick rundown as to what the latest position is in regard to pay for NHS staff?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Steve. So yeah, we were offered our given our pay award of 3% this year. It was due in April, and we've only just seen it in our last pay packet. So it was delayed. And during that period, we've been campaigning with our trade unions for a proper restorative pay increase, which our campaign, we're campaigning for 15%. Various other unions have slightly different asks, with the Royal College of Nursing asking for 12.5 and Unison something slightly different as well. So we've been campaigning hard for about 15 months in the build up to this pay award announcement, and our unions have been campaigning with us, and then the government obviously came back with this 3% pay award, which a lot of people have said various times, how do you feel about this pay rise? And quite simply, it's not a pay rise to us. This is further pay restraint. It's a further pay cut after over a decade of cuts to our pay. You know, you factor in the increase in national insurance, you factor in people's pension contributions going up as their wages rise. Some people are taking home less, and it's a pay award that's going to do nothing to solve any of the problems in the NHS when, you know, we've seen what's going on in the press now with hospitals on black alert, with 20, 30 ambulances piled up, 100,000 vacancies across the NHS. So it's pitiful, really, that the government would think that 3% is in any way acceptable. So we've been campaigning, we continue campaigning, and our unions are balloting us. And that's where we're sitting at the moment.
Ruby, you're teaching nurses rather than nursing directly at the moment, but you're obviously up to the elbows in this campaign as well. So have you got anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, so I guess, so I'm one of the co-founders of the Feminist Nursing Network, who kind of, I don't know, maybe amplify the work of, you know, Nurses Say No and NHS Workers Say No around the kind of the pay campaign. I guess I'm not directly affected by this pay deal, but I have been an NHS nurse before I went into education, and part of my reason for leaving was I was incredibly burnt out. The you know, the conditions that I was working in were not sustainable then, and they are, you know, beyond unsustainable now. And the pay that I was getting didn't reflect the, you know, the work that I was doing, and it was, for me, quite a painful decision. And I think that's probably similar for a lot of NHS workers who have gone through similar experiences or who are in that position now. But we are seeing many NHS workers leaving. Certainly, like an exodus of midwives is happening at the moment, because of this underfunding and because of a lack of pay justice.
And Holly J, you are coming to us straight from actually from the front line, having just finished your shift. You were saying a little bit about what the situation is with your hospital in terms of staff being asked to work extra and the general kind of unmanageability of the situation. Last year we saw lots of claps. This year we're seeing poultry pay rises. I mean, what's your perspective on it there, right from the front line?
So in oncology, we're seeing a lot of delays in diagnosis and treatment, and it's leading to a lot of very unwell patients. And I could even, it's causing premature deaths, really. Staff are really demoralised, they're burnt out. And, this was even before the pandemic and the effects of the waiting lists and referrals. In my sort of career time, I've been qualified for 17, 18 years now. And I've noticed that, a lot of people are leaving. And, our workload, our responsibilities and skills have increased, but without the pay to match. And a lot of newly qualified nurses are coming into the NHS and leaving relatively quickly, but with £60,000 worth of debt on top of that as well, and it's just a really stressful atmosphere and unmanageable.
On the run of events was that originally the government was saying it was going to give a 1% pay rise. What kind of reaction did that get on the at the coalface when that news came out?
Yeah, I mean, complete uproar. Obviously, it's like a bad joke, isn't it? When we're faced with the situation we're faced with, and as Ruby and Holly both said, like there's an exodus of staff leaving. We've got, a ridiculous amount of vacancies. It's 100,000 predicted, if it follows the same trend, predicted to be 250,000 by 2030. I mean, that's just the end of the health service. We're struggling, to function and keep our patients safe as it is. I work in a mental health trust, and for patients, there's months and months of a wait to be allocated a care coordinator, and a 2 to 3 year wait for psychological therapies in the mental health trust where I work. That is not sustainable, and particularly post-pandemic, it's utterly unsustainable. I was having a conversation with my dad actually yesterday about what the government are saying about we're going to pump £6 million into the NHS to help it, and my dad was saying to me, "But what do you think that's going to do? What can that do?" And I was really lost for answers, because what can chucking money at things do at the moment? What we need is staff, but we know to have qualified nurses and doctors, it takes several years to train. We know that a lot of people aren't training anymore because the fees have been introduced, because the bursary's been slashed. So people are coming out, as Holly said, with £60,000-70,000 debt to come into a very poorly paid job, which is really, really stressful. People, many of our colleagues have become incredibly sick, and many of our colleagues have died throughout the pandemic, So we're faced with this desperate situation, and then you hear 1%, which is just I have to laugh because it is just laughable. But 3% isn't really any better. Some NHS workers are up to 20% worse off in real terms due to real terms cuts over the last decade under this Tory government. So we need a restorative pay increase. We desperately need to be retaining staff. I know a lot of staff that have left the NHS recently, and a lot of staff that are planning to leave. And I mean nursing staff and experienced staff that have worked in the NHS for 10, 15, 20 years. And we can't afford to be losing that experience, but they're going. They've absolutely had enough. They're exhausted. And people are saying, I'm going to put myself and my family first. Work's making me quite unwell. the number of NHS staff off sick with stress and, dealing with their emotional well-being is at an absolute record high. So yeah, an absolute insult and pitiful. And I think, that's why we're seeing NHS workers who are mobilising and organising and fighting back and demanding better, because we certainly can't carry on as we are. Our patient care is being compromised, which goes against everything that we hope for coming into these jobs. And if we don't fight back, the health service, I truly believe the health service will be finished. And I think that's what this government want, is to privatise the health service. They know that there's a lot of money to be made out of people being unwell and needing services. So, we need to stop them, and we need to be uniting on that.
It makes me think of Noam Chomsky. Sorry, Steve, I jumped in anticipating you there. I was just going to say, this paints a picture of what Noam Chomsky actually said very famously. He said it's the standard technique of privatization. Defund, make sure things don't work, people get angry, and then you hand it over to private capital. And that is 100% what is being done here to people. Holly, you mentioned the extra money that the Conservative government say they're going to put into the NHS. The problem is that extra money, it's reported, is going to go into diagnostics and tests, which obviously those things are needed, but they're being bought in from the private sector. So that money is going straight into the private providers of MRIs, CT scans, X-rays, all of those kind of diagnostics that people need to have. It ought to be taking place in an NHS hospital and operated by directly employed NHS staff. It should not be money going into shareholders' pockets.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's how, the government are saying we're gonna get rid of these waiting lists by, I think, next Easter or something. They're trying to say they're going to, I don't know how they're going to get through over 5 million people on waiting lists. But as you say, Bonnie, it will be, ploughing more money into private providers who are just going to see them and treat them, which is terrible.
I don't see the demand going down before Easter, because they seem to be doing everything they can to prolong the epidemic, the pandemic. So we're going to carry on seeing those numbers grow at least until Easter, I would imagine.
Yeah, I know that we're topping sort of 5 million on waiting lists, and I did read somewhere that it's predicted to top up, hit about 13 million. I don't know if it was by the beginning of next year. I can't remember where I read it, but I can well believe it. I know what the waiting lists are like in my trust. I know what the waiting lists are like for people to even have an initial assessment. And, I work with children. It's not okay for children needing mental health support who are in a crisis to be waiting months and months, to even have an initial assessment.
Holly J, what do you make of that?
So I think, I've heard as well, Holly. I think it's around 13 million predicted on that waiting list as well, on waiting lists. I just wanted to come in about sort of outsourcing and how sort of reliant really that we are on each shift. We have outsourced bank agency workers covering shifts. And a lot of nurses and support workers are choosing to leave the NHS and go into doing full-time agency work. So because it looks like initially good sort of good pay, and they can pick and choose shifts to suit them. But obviously we know, with the private contracts that over time, their workers' rights are eroded. And things like sick pay and annual leave, they all come into it. But that's a thing that we're seeing on the front line, is that staff are choosing to go into work for private companies full time, and ultimately the sort of more staff that leave to go into to work for private companies. We won't have an NHS because the workforce isn't there.
Yeah, and
the thing to remember with all the agencies is that, of course, for every pound that the NHS pays the agency to employ these staff, the agency are taking a cut from that as well. So that money is not staying in the pockets of the workers. And the big fact to remember is the economic payoff from our NHS, which is the biggest employer in England after all. And it's an absolute fact that people that earn the least spend the most. They spend the biggest proportion of their income. And running alongside the downgrading and the evisceration of the NHS, we've seen our high streets fail. Now, certainly where I live, there are a number of businesses that are supported by the staff that work in the hospitals and by the patients that visit the hospitals. If the nurses and the other workers in the NHS are getting real terms pay cuts, they can't be spending the money in the local economy. And therefore, the whole of the environment goes down.
Ruby, you were about to come in?
I was going to essentially say what Bonnie did about, if no, it's great. If an NHS trust is needing to fill shifts with agency workers because there aren't the staff on the books to cover that rota, then of course that's more money going into private businesses. That's, public funds which are being spent lining somebody else's pockets rather than going to direct patient care. But also I think, it's thinking about how the 3% pay rise is then going to be viewed by the public, and a lot of people aren't receiving pay rises anywhere close to 3% this year. And I guess, when people are on really long waiting lists and they're not receiving the care that they need, or a loved one isn't receiving the care that they need, to see that the NHS workers are receiving a 3% pay rise and then, quite rightly moving towards industrial action to protest that. I think it's a very tactical move by the Tories to create that hostility, to kind of, push that scarcity narrative that there isn't the funds for this pay rise because there isn't the funds for anyone's pay rise, when really we know that there definitely is. It's just all in the wrong place.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, there's always a magic money tree available when it suits them to want one. It's just it's a useful excuse, and sadly one that the Labour Party pirates as well. I'm curious, Ruth, as somebody who's teaching nurses, what impact are you seeing at the student nurse level on existing student nurses, but also on levels of kind of demand for the courses? How many people want to train? Is it feeding through in that? People thinking it's not worth the amount of debt it's going to incur to try to get into it, etc.
It's a funny one, because you'd think with all of the the media coverage of how bad our conditions are and how bad our pay is, that students wouldn't be wanting to train as nurses. But I think it's also twinned with their kind of the way in which higher education is being treated at the moment, is that actually nursing is quite a viable degree for a lot of people, because there is always going to be work for you. You do come out with a Bachelor of Science degree, so even if you don't want to go into nursing, that's still a degree that has quite a weighting when there's this kind of culture war about not getting an arts degree. So we are seeing huge numbers of applicants at the moment to come onto nursing courses. Certainly the two universities that I've worked in have had record numbers kind of enrolling for the past 2 years, which is fantastic. But then if they're going out to practice, because student nurses spend 50% of their time out in clinical practice on the wards and clinics, working with nurses. If those nurses are, looking after 16 patients, if, they're already burnt out, if we don't have the resources, they're chronically understaffed. We're seeing a lot of staff off quite, understandably with long-term sickness. Student nurses aren't getting the support that they need out in practice, and that has a knock-on effect to us as educators. It's a lot of my work time is spent supporting nurses out in practice to teach nursing students, and also ferrying a lot of student anxiety. But it's a really unworkable situation. We can't have highly trained, effective nurses, and I trust that every one of my students will be when they graduate. But but their experience before they've even got their, you know, their NMC pin, before they've even received their first paycheck, is of an NHS which is, you know, just on its knees, basically.
And I think Holly T, I think it was mentioned that, you know, there's a high dropout rate then if people once they get into full-time nursing, that they burn out. They can't take the you know, take the reality once they get there. We've got a question in from Felicity Dowling. She says, what would bring staff back? So in terms of qualified staff who've left the profession, I mean, is it easy to get back in? Because I mean, your registration can lapse after a few years, can't it? And you've got to then retrain or you know, do some kind of requalification, don't you, to even get back onto the front line if you want to.
Yeah, so you have to, so qualified nurses have to revalidate every 3 years, which means they need to provide evidence of, I think it's 450 hours practice over 3 years. Correct me, Ruby or Holly, if that's wrong. I think it's something like that over 3 years. And yeah, if you don't maintain that, your registration will lapse and you have to do university return training, which I don't know, is it a year, Ruby?
I think is it 18 months?
Yeah, yeah.
So there's like a practice element to it.
I mean, from what I hear, I can't speak for every person that's left the NHS, but from what I hear when I speak to people that are leaving, I think what would bring staff back is for them to feel safe. Staff don't feel safe. You feel very vulnerable. You have a professional qualification, and you have a standard of care that you have to adhere to. You have a professional code of practice that you have to adhere to. And I think a lot of people feel like they're failing in that. And people are saying, you know, I feel like I'm giving substandard care because I can't give my patients what they need because I'm so stretched. Someone said to me this week that she had to look after 17 patients across 2 wards on her shift. That is not possible, and that is
safe ratio is what, 7 or something? I think the maximum supposedly, isn't it? Yeah.
Well,
I mean, there isn't a safe staffing level. There's nothing.
No.
There's nothing in writing. There's no legal safe staffing level for nurses
Right.
in England.
Used to be, that was the number that used to get bandied around when I first started writing about the NHS, 2012. So you know, they used to say 6 or 7 and beyond that was getting risky, and now you're talking about 17 patients for one single nurse, not even all in the same ward either. I mean, that's horrific. But Holly J, you were there in your nurse's uniform. I mean, you must have colleagues that have recently left or are thinking of leaving, etc. What do you think it would take for the you know, for them to stay on and for others who've left to come back?
I think I don't think this government respects carers in any sense of the word. So I think a lot of it would be, you know, some acknowledgement for, you know, for what we do, some respect for that, but also and recognition. But you know, pay has a massive part to play. You know, at the moment, there's no incentive to come into the NHS, and as we mentioned before, you know, once you qualify, you as a nurse, you know, you've got £60,000 worth of debt. I think seeing fighting unions that are backing its members, I think that would draw people in. You know, giving them confidence that, you know, we've got unions on our side fighting for us. And yeah, I just think better conditions. So, you know, we can only achieve that with more staff, and, you know, more manageable workloads.
Absolutely. I mean, let's talk about the reaction of the union so far. Who wants to give us a quick summary as to where things stand with the union response to the recent pay, you know, pay offer such as it is, and then we'll go into a little bit about what the reality of that offer is as it works out for people, and also the response from other political parties to the campaign to try to get the proper pay rise that's going to restore things for nurses. So, who wants to jump in on that first question? Unions, it was, in case somebody's forgotten.
Do you want me to jump in?
Yeah, go for it, Holly.
Yeah, so the 4 leading health unions have recently balloted all of their members. So we've got Unison, GMB, Unite and Royal College of Nursing. There's also been ballots from Royal College of Midwifery, Royal College of Podiatrists, Optometrists, I think, perhaps. So there have been, I can't think of every single union which has balloted, but overwhelmingly there has been a reject come back. Some of the turnouts haven't been as high as possibly we would have hoped for. So, for example, Royal College of Nursing, they got about, it was over 90% of people who voted reject, but it was about a 25% turnout, which I think a lot of people felt a bit disappointed that it wasn't much higher and we're not getting really, really close to that 50%. But we do have to remember that this is the highest turnout Royal College of Nursing's ever had for an indicative ballot. So it is only 25%, but it shows, you know, organising is working and it's showing how angry the members are. So I think it's something we have to be motivated. We have to be motivated by, and we just have to continue building on that. Otherwise, the alternative is to just give up, which we don't want to be doing. So Unite and Unison had quite similar turnouts. GMB did achieve over 50% in some of their regions. It wasn't an overall 50% across the whole of the country, but in some regions they got over 50%, which I think is what's given them the confidence to go straight to the strike ballot rather than another indicative ballot, which is what the Royal College of Nursing are doing. We're waiting to hear from Unison and Unite what their next steps are going to be, whether they're going to do more indicative ballots. So it's kind of just a waiting game. And then the problem is, like, a lot of it does fall down on the members and it falls down on the reps, which the members are the union. We know that. We use that phrase all the time. But when you've got a really exhausted and quite demoralised workforce, it's pretty full on to be getting ballots passed. It's pretty hard work. I'm a rep for my union, and you know, I phone banked hundreds of members on the last indicative ballots, and it's full on. If you want to get the results, it's very, very hard work. And I think when people are so exhausted at work to then say, "Oh, do you want to be a rep and do you want to build for these ballots?" I think people have just had enough. And when they finish work and go home, they just want to switch off from it, and who can blame them? So there's still a lot of work to do, but I remain positive.
There's two aspects on that. There's two aspects on that, you know, in what you said there that I want to look at. I mean, one is, you know, the exhaustion. You know, there is a definite political kind of push, I think, you know, by the powers that be to keep people busy, poor, you know, borderline poor, so they're struggling to, you know, they're worried about where the next meal's coming from. Keep people tired, you know, so that they haven't got time and energy to think about getting political, I think is the one thing. And the other thing, in terms of the level of the response you got in the strike ballot, you know, obviously, you know, I think probably a majority of people that got into healthcare do have some sense of vocation, would be the word that used to get used about them, if it still does, but you know, this sense of commitment to actually trying to help people and make them better. So I mean, to what extent do you think that that's getting exploited by the government and others to you know, to push things further than they'd get away with if it was a different sector, for example? You know, Holly, Jay, do you want to come in on that?
Sorry, I was just going to sort of briefly mention the health and care bill, because I noticed that as a question. Is that okay, or do you want me to?
Well, yeah, I'll put that on the list and we'll come back to it in a minute. But let's go on that particular point first, while we're warm to it from the topic, from the conversation. Otherwise, it'll drift by probably.
Just remind me what the last point was about the unions.
It's just about the feeling of a vocation that people often go into healthcare with, or at least of a commitment to wanting the best for their patients, and also the levels of exhaustion there that stop people maybe from being as politically aware and engaged as they probably should be for their own self-interest. You know, so how much do you think that gets exploited by the government and also by hospital management, etc.?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's really hard, and you know, Holly will know this, sort of, you know, every day having conversations with our colleagues, and it's really hard to keep people engaged. and even just small asks, people are quite reluctant to do at times. So it really is a long haul, and we're up against it because you don't always have time to have the conversations at work, and people are just fed up with it. They don't want to hear it. So it's hard. So I mean, at times, through the year, the mood has shifted and people have become quite angry, especially sort of on the back of like announcements like the 1% or the 3%, on the back of announcements. The mood has been quite angry, and it is quite, you have to kind of use that to get people engaged and sort of, ask them in turn to do things that could help. But yeah, I think, the government knows that we're demoralised. I think this is, being done on purpose, personally, so that it is more difficult to get organised. And I think, that's why we're seeing a lot of grassroots campaigns coming through that put pressure on the unions. And, I'll leave it there for now.
What about the public as well? Because I mean, there's I think as somebody who's written about the NHS for the best part of a decade now, there is a level of kind of fatalism among the public where it's almost like they're so used to this stuff happening that it almost becomes background noise now. Are you getting levels of support from the public on this that you would want to see? And for those who do want to support, I mean, practically speaking, what can they do to help the campaign and to help NHS workers get what they're worth?
I think we've seen with the public, it's been quite variable. I think there's been a lot of media about, nurses being greedy and it's not the right time for a pay rise, things like that. And I think, it's quite hard to turn this narrative round, but as Holly mentioned, I think we need to be united in doing that, and I think unite across the public sector. And again, speaking in a personal capacity, I think a general strike would be the way forward to unite people. But I think we just need to get the information out there to the public, that our fight is everybody's fight. And it's for the future of the NHS.
Yeah, I think just off the back of that, Holly, like if you think about it kind of historically, we've seen massive kind of upsurges in union membership. With the inception of the NHS, there was, and the kind of broadening of the public sector, there was, really powerful unions, or certainly more active unions and union membership, which has just dwindled since we're the government has been selling bits of the public sector off from Thatcher through to now. And if we want staff retention, if we want an NHS that works properly, we need staff in it, and those staff quite often are members of unions, which makes the union stronger and bigger, and have a more direct fight to take to the government, which is a challenge to their power. I think that this is a definite political move to keep silencing and stamping down the unions, because there is a solution to this current NHS crisis, which is, we talk about, resources and sustainable services, but workers are part of that resource, right? You can't just have a hospital building without workers in it. And historically, the NHS has been a massive site of union organising.
Well, we've seen, Holly mentioned about the media presenting nurses, trying to portray nurses as greedy. As Amanda's pointed out here, I mean, it's not just about nurses, is it? It's about porters, cleaners, healthcare assistants, domestics. It's the admin staff. It's everybody in that together. And Holly T, I think it was, you gave me an example as to how this, the 3% that is getting awarded at the moment has actually turned out to be a practical pay cut for a lot of, especially the lower paid workers within the NHS. And these guys need a 15% pay rise just the same as anybody else. Do you want to give us some details as to how 3% rise is translated into an actual reduction?
Yeah, so I know in particular the one that stands out to me is that I know for our band 3 colleagues, which could be healthcare assistants, therapy assistants, admin, you know, all sorts of different staff on a band 3 who do really, really important work across hospitals and communities and in surgeries. You know, our phlebotomists, all sorts of people are band 3s, and for them, when they got their 3%, it pushed them up on their salary, and you know, their pension contribution jumped by nearly 2%. So for our band 3 colleagues, who were near the top of their band, which means they've been working at that level for many years to be where they are on their band with a lot of experience, it actually translated to a pay cut for them, which, you know, I mean, how completely demoralising for people to be dealt that at the moment. And, you know, every single person across the NHS is so valuable. None of the services would function without our domestics, our administrators, our healthcare assistants, our porters. So, you know, this is all of our fight, and we're all fighting together. But thinking about the unions as well, a lot of conversations I've had with our lower banded staff, many of them aren't in unions. So a big part of our campaign has been to try and push union engagement and try and encourage people to not only join the trade unions, but to get active in their trade unions. Because, you know, if you're not a member, you're not going to be having a vote in these important ballots. So that's been a massive part of our campaign is to push union engagement, because it's more important than ever, I think, at the moment. The way this government is, the way the opposition are, you know, the trade union movement is really, really important right now for all workers.
Yes, and you say people at the top of their band 3, but, you know, we're not talking money bags here, are we? What kind of levels of salary are you talking about? Somebody who's at the top of band 3 and getting pushed into a, you know, what was it? Instead of a 5.6%, I think it was 7.1%. So it's quite a hefty increase in the level of pension contributions that people are having to make because of that change. So what kind of levels of pay are those folk on?
Yeah, so the people towards the top of band 3 will be earning around between £20,000 to £21,000 a year. And these are highly skilled and experienced staff that are going to be working at that level. Who are going to, and that's at the top of their band, not at the lower end, which, as I said, is going to mean they've worked at that grade for many, many years to be where they are. And they're seeing this, and they're seeing a cut, which, you know, absolutely demoralising for those colleagues, and you can't blame them when they then are thinking about going to work elsewhere, or when they're, as Holly highlighted, when they're thinking about going to work for agencies and private companies where their hourly rate is going to be much, much more. It must feel like a no-brainer.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine all this stuff isn't by design, really, isn't it? When you start putting it all together, it looks very, very fishy. Speaking of by design, Holly, Jay, I promised you we'd come back onto the health and social care bill that they're pushing through the government at the minute. What was it that you wanted to highlight out of that, please?
So I was just going to mention sort of, from my understanding of the health and care bill and what it will mean for NHS staff, and ultimately, you know, the care of patients. But it takes, there's talk of taking away our sort of, it's a move away from our current national pay scheme, which is the agenda for change. From my understanding, I think the integrated care systems will have like a block budget, local budget, which in turn will affect our pay and how it's distributed, and ultimately our terms and conditions as well. There's going to be sort of a lack of accountability and a sort of deregulation of professional bodies. So, you know, people will be sort of de-skilling essentially through no fault of their own. But yeah, it just seems like that, you know, it's a move to have sort of less democratic control. So, and you know, we're very worried about this as a workforce. But I do think we need to get the information out there to staff and patients and public in sort of in terms that we can all understand, to try and fight this and get the unions on board, pass motions, write to our MPs, things like that.
Bonnie, Ruby and the other Holly, what's your perspective on this bill?
Well, I've done a few shows about ICSs. We know that they're absolutely lethal. In fact, the trusts that will be operating these are actually going to get financially rewarded for refusing and turning down care for people. So the less care they provide, the more money they've got left in their bank accounts, which is utterly awful. But also, one of the things that occurs to me in this conversation about the money merry-go-round, the pay rise in inverted commas that's been offered is to come out of existing NHS budgets. So this is not extra money. And the bottom line is, in actual fact, there's a piece of research that's been done a couple of years ago, and it pointed out that often the efficiencies actually do not end up saving money. So, for example, we've lost about 17,000 beds over the last decade. And the loss of those beds has caused bed shortages of about 8,500 per day. Now, the total cost of those lack of beds is in the region of £13 billion. That'll go a long way to giving nurses, care workers, people in the NHS a decent pay rise, wouldn't it? So they've cut the beds, they've increased the cost. It's a complete false economy. Like, it's the definition of a false economy. I just wondered if I could come in about the union issue as well. So most of the people on the worst pay in the NHS will be women, they will be BAME, they will be other minority groups. And I think there really does need to be urgently gender pay gap reports produced, so that we can look at the inequalities of this pay rise, because a 3% pay rise on a person's wages that are £18,000 a year is going to mean the world to that person. But it will mean much less, 3%, when you're already on a top rated salary. If you're on £50,000-60,000 a year, 3% is a nice to have. At £18,000 a year, 3% is the very least you can possibly do to survive. And the bottom line is, so long as we've got NHS workers relying on food banks, they're not being paid enough. And another thing as well, it's recognised that where people are collectivised in a trade union, they secure better pay, better terms and conditions, and so on. The fact of the matter is, trade union membership amongst women and BAME people is not at a good enough level. And I can't help but wonder if the unions could come up with a creative way, the unions that are working in health could come up with a creative way to make it easier for women and BAME people to join a trade union. That would be good, because trade union subs every month out of a low pay packet is an extra stretch. It's another ask on a limited budget. And also, women tend to have more caring responsibilities outside of the workplace. So to get active and engaged and involved in your trade union is something that's an ask beyond something that's achievable by women. So again, we need to get much more creative across the whole of our movement to ensure that the trade unions are wholly representative of the workforce that they're representing.
Holly T?
Yeah, I agree with everything Bonnie's saying. And just thinking about, kind of going back to where Bonnie explained about the pay rise coming out of existing budgets, while we've been doing our campaigning, the whole time when we've been saying, 15% restorative pay increase, that's the least we're owed, and it must be fully funded by the government, not come out of existing budgets. Because I think really it's quite a shrewd move by the government to hand over the opportunity to demonise us, really, because we know that people are struggling to get appointments. We've seen how GPs have been being treated in the press absolutely appallingly recently, because of people struggling to get appointments, when we know we have less GPs per capita than any other country in Europe and a shortage of 50,000 doctors. So then you see us being offered a pay rise. You see the government saying it has to come out of NHS budgets. You see us then demanding more, and the government are saying, well, this is their vocation, this is their calling. People can't get an appointment, and now they're demanding even more money out of NHS budgets. So it all just feeds feeds into that narrative, doesn't it? Which is really, really dangerous. And the way I've seen the GPs be treated has really worried me over the last few weeks, because it will only be another staff group that is being attacked like that next. It won't end there, I don't think.
No, and
Ruby?
I think with the GPs as well, like obviously GPs agree their own salaries because they're now run like separate businesses to the NHS. They're just given NHS money and then they decide what they plan their services with. But the 3% pay rise for the staff on Agenda for Change, which there are staff working in GP surgeries or salaried by GP surgeries who are on that Agenda for Change pay scale. GP practices are then having to make that decision as well between, where does that money come from? And that's coming out of GP salaries. And these are staff who are already working beyond their capacities at the moment, who are receiving, all sorts of abuse, who are then being told by the government to essentially take a pay cut in order to fund somebody else's pay rise. And so across the NHS, we can see that staff are basically being pitted against patients by the people holding the purse strings to say, well, you either choose patient care or you choose a pay rise. And if you choose one, your workers starve. If you choose the other, well, then you're selfish. When really there is no situation where either side can win or really get what they need from either decision.
So we have a situation in which, and I mean, it's one thing I don't think it came up yet in the conversation, but we were chatting about it before the programme, the fact that the Band 2 staff in the NHS are now getting paid just a single penny above minimum wage level since the recent rise in minimum wage done by the government. So we have, poorly paid staff. We have NHS at breaking point. We've got legislation going through the House, which is going to make all of this worse and allow the government's mates to line their pockets without any kind of proper scrutiny. Surely, and I said this very tongue-in-cheek, the opposition parties are up in arms about this and absolutely kicking up a stink and fighting tooth and nail to prevent it all happening and getting worse. What's the reality? What have you seen, Holly T, from political parties, including the so-called opposition?
We've had a lot of support from quite a few MPs within the Socialist campaign group. Some of them have been really supportive. In particular, John Trickett passed an early day motion around 15%. And he also presented our NHS Pay 15 petition to Parliament on the day that we delivered it to 10 Downing Street. And we had a lot of opposition MPs come out that day. We held a rally outside Parliament and many of them came and spoke, and several of them came into Downing Street with us. So we have had some good support from the Socialist campaign group. We haven't had any support from the leadership or any communication with the leadership, despite we've reached out several times to try and get support and engage in some conversation at the very least, but we've had no engagement there at all. The Green Party passed a motion at their conference to back 15%. And the Green Party trade union group have been pretty supportive of us. They've held a couple of rallies and they've been out leafleting when we've been out and supporting people on the ground. I know that in Sheffield they've been quite supportive of Holly and her local campaign as well. So bits of support, but disappointingly not enough, nowhere near enough to put a significant amount of pressure on the government to build up towards us getting a restorative pay increase. I think it's been incredibly disappointing, really, especially when we see the state of the health service.
Yes, I mean, it hasn't just been a lack of response from Keir Starmer either, has it? Because it's been, John Trickett publicised, and I'm rubbing my face because I'm so exhausted and exasperated about this, but, John Trickett reported that he'd asked Keir Starmer to sign his early day motion and to support his kind of attempt to drum up support for this in Parliament, and that Keir Starmer had flatly refused to do so. So, what, Bonnie, you you, like me, come from a Labour Party background. What do you make of a Labour leader, I use that term loosely, who is prepared to refuse to back NHS staff and actually allowed himself to be, you know, we shouldn't forget that, you know, when the Tories were talking about a 1% pay rise initially, Labour, you know, boldly stepped forward with a 2.1% pay rise, which was still utterly ridiculous, and then allowed himself to be outflanked by the bloody Tories again on the left by, you know, them coming in and offering 3%. So he let them look good, offering, you know, to the uneducated at least, offering peanuts instead of making them pay politically and financially, you know, in terms of either give NHS staff a proper rise or not. You know, what's going on with the Labour Party at the minute, and, you know, is there any hope?
Well, we've had 40 years at least of deliberate destruction of the NHS, preparing it for privatisation and handing ever increasing amounts of the budget for our health service to go into private pockets. And that includes during the last Labour government. In 2017 and 2019, I got motions through conference to remove the private interests of working within the NHS, so for it to be fully publicly provided. They were passed unanimously in 17 and 19, and those motions did form part of the manifestos in those 2 years too. This year, I again got to propose a motion to call for the renationalisation entirely of the NHS and strip out all the private interests and campaign against ICSs. I got up to speak after the Shadow Secretary of State for Health, John Ashworth, had given his speech. I got called to the stage, and I got up the steps, and John Ashworth decided that was for the time for him to leave the stage. I'd like to say I couldn't believe it, but it was entirely in character. He had no interest whatsoever in what the delegates demanded the party did for the NHS. And then, of course, we had this situation when Keir was giving his closing speech at the end of conference, and he actually asked the delegates to stand up and clap for the nurses. We already know that that doesn't pay the bills. That doesn't make sure that healthcare workers' families are fed. They need a pay rise, and he really needs to start coming out, fighting for the things that the membership and the general public, in my belief, demand from our party. We're supposed to be the opposition, for heaven's sake. Start looking after our people.
Who's next?
Sorry, you guys are too ranty there.
Well, no, but I think some things are worth ranting about, you know, and I mean, it's worth pointing out again the state of things in the Labour Party at the minute that, you know, by and large, Labour members and Labour conferences are very supportive of properly nationalising the NHS and properly paying the people who work in it. But we have seen on that and a number of other topics, the current excuse for leadership just deciding that it can ignore Labour's rules that says conference is the sovereign body of the party, and ignore the conference's resolutions and just go, well, you know, we don't think that, we don't like that one, therefore we're just going to ignore it. And, you know, they are acting as a law to themselves. And, you know, a law to themselves, you know, you might excuse that if they're using that, you know, power to fight on behalf of ordinary people, but they seem to be acting on behalf of, you know, vested interests and the establishment in order to actually deprive ordinary people of any kind of proper political representation.
Well, I mean, those policies, Steve, in 17, particularly in 2017, were overwhelmingly supported by the general public. Labour, for turning its back on those manifesto pledges, which we must remember is something Keir Starmer, in his bid to be leader of the Labour Party, said he was going to stand by those manifestos. He's rolled back entirely from that. And effectively, he's going to lose all of those votes, all of those people, ordinary people that believe that we've got a Labour Party that's going to start looking after ordinary people. No more of this business as usual that we've seen under the Conservatives, under the Blair years. We need an alternative.
And we have seen, you know, even just today, the Labour Party come up with its, you know, the first time I think that they've actually mentioned a proper policy in any sense. But that policy is going to make a difference of about 35p a week to the majority of people that it's targeted at, when you know, most of them have just lost 20 quid. And that's this kind of, you know, nitpicking, lack of vision that, just coming from, a political background where you just think, it's failures of imagination at what cost, and winning an argument is easy if you make one, certainly a lot easier if you make one than if you don't, which is what we're seeing at the minute. And, the lack of willingness to stand up for nurses, and I'll confess my bias in that I'm married to a nurse, although she's taken early retirement because, she had grandkids she wanted to look after, etc. But, I saw what she used to go through at each shift. And, that's what got me into writing about the NHS in the first place. So, these people deserve proper pay. They deserve full recognition. They deserve to be treated like the, kings and queens of the country, really, certainly much better than than any kind of other grandee or royal family that we've got. And I'm in danger of going off on my own rant at the moment, so I'm going to shut up. But, we've got 3 minutes left. Who wants to run us out for 3 minutes and talk about something that we haven't touched on as yet?
I suppose it would.
Yeah,
of course.
Sorry, go on.
No, all I was going to say, because you mentioned earlier, what can the public do if they want to support NHS workers and get involved? And I think we ended up talking about something else and didn't really finish. Like, one of the main things I would say to members of the public that support NHS workers and our health service is, fight against that misinformation that's out there. Get educated on the facts and figures, and tell people those, these are the vacancy rates. This is what's going on. This is what the waiting lists are. This is what the future is going to look like if we don't take action and get behind our NHS workers now in fighting for change. Our health service is going to be finished, and just be spreading that message. And, we're having those conversations in the workplace, but we need the general public having those conversations in the street too. Sorry, Bonnie. I know you wanted to.
No, that's a really important point. There are various petitions and so on available online as well. So Steve, can we put out through the various channels some links to some petitions that people can sign to try and increase the pressure? Because the Labour Party is supposed to be the party of the NHS, but they need to start remembering that, and they need to start earning that name, honestly. And they'll only do it if we make them. So let's get those petitions signed. Let's get some members of the general public mobilised, because it's all of our health service.
Very good. Well, we've got 1 minute left. Anybody want to say anything very quickly before we round off? Otherwise, we'll I'll save you a whole extra minute on your evening, and we'll let people get about their business. Going. No, gone. So, thank you everybody who's been with us and watched the show right through. Thank you if you're watching this on catch up. Do remember to do your bit on your preferred social media channel to follow social media and Squawk Box if you get a chance. To follow Socialist Telly, and Squawk Box. And make sure that you keep up with Holly and Ruby and the campaign for 15% for NHS workers. They deserve that and more. And we need politicians in power and in opposition who are prepared to do what it takes to make that happen. Have a great week, everybody, and thank you again for your time.